Hey everybody, this is Scott Mann, founder and director of the Stability Institute, and I appreciate you watching today. Today we're going to be covering some of my observations, post-academic week observations from the class that Howard Clark and I taught entitled Tribal Dynamics and Local Resiliencies in Afghanistan. So I'm really glad you're here watching this, and let's jump right into it. The first major takeaway that I had from this class that I shared with hundreds of special operators as they came through the course of the week was that the policy and strategy in Afghanistan, our policy and our strategy, is changing very quickly. And let's face it, there is a lot of emphasis on transition, on handoff over to the Afghans, and frankly on withdrawal from the country of United States and coalition forces. This seems to be a very singular focus as we step through things over there. Why does that matter? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because there are a range of realities within Afghanistan that we have to pay attention to no matter how our strategy or policy changes. And I hear all the time that things are really changing in Afghanistan, that the strategy is moving so quickly. But the fact of the matter is, the realities in Afghanistan, the things that make that country tick, that underpin the operating logic of that country, they don't change that much. They really don't. They're actually fairly timeless in many ways and will probably remain for our lifetime. So no matter how our strategy or our policy changes, we've really got to pay attention to the realities of Afghanistan if we're serious about posturing ourselves for long-term stability there and a foreign internal defense plan that will keep our homeland safe and Afghanistan stable. So what are those realities that I'm talking about? Well, let's go into them because there's several that I think really drive the point home that I'm talking about here. The first one is there is a significant gap between top and bottom in Afghanistan. The center and the periphery, as Thomas Barfield refers to it in his book. Afghanistan has always been challenged. Its central government has always been challenged in its ability to stabilize many of its outlying rural areas throughout the country. And this has always been the case, even in the best of times from the 1920s to the 1970s during the Mujahideen period, often referred to as the golden era, the golden age of Afghanistan. Even then, there were a lot of differences and gaps between the top and the bottom. And what's the so what of that? Well, the so what is that the top-down approach in Afghanistan, it doesn't work. It's never worked except for a few times in Afghanistan's history. The top-down approach of projecting security, economic development, governance from the center and forcing it out into these rural areas simply does not work. Afghanistan is called the graveyard of empires for a reason. And it is largely because any time an external power has tried to impose a centralized system on this country, or even an Afghan ruler, it has always failed. So the top-down approach in Afghanistan really doesn't work because of this gap between top and bottom. And the rural areas, which is my next point, the rural areas really matter a lot. And it doesn't seem like we pay a lot of attention to them, especially now as we go into transition and Overwatch. It seems that we're paying less attention to the rural areas. But guess what? The rural areas, 70 to 80% of the Afghan population still live in rural areas within Afghanistan, not in the cities. So my question to you is this. If that's the case, if this is a population-centric endeavor, and 70 to 80% of the Afghan population live in rural areas, then why is our focus on connecting Kabul to Kandahar, securing Ring Road, and key terrain districts that get the preponderance of resources, authorities, and weight of effort? Why are all of those urban-focused items central to the campaign? I know we need them, but the fact of the matter remains, the rural areas really matter, and we ignore the rural areas at our peril. This is because most of the social uprisings in Afghanistan, most of the rebellions, and there have been a lot of them throughout Afghanistan's history, have almost exclusively come from the countryside, from the rural areas, and today is no different. So we ignore the rural areas at our peril. No matter how much we want to focus on transition and Overwatch, we cannot ignore the rural areas and the fact that most of the social uprisings throughout this country's history came from these rural areas. Not only that, there are a range of ethnic tensions that we've got to pay attention to in Afghanistan. As we go into transition and beyond, there are a lot of things that can go wrong with this approach, and we need to be ready for that. We don't need to look through rose-colored glasses as we pursue stability in Afghanistan with a smaller footprint and frankly further removed from the rural areas. There are lots of ways this thing could go sideways, and these ethnic tensions between the Pashtuns, the Hazaras, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, they could play out in a range of ways, much like they did in the ethnic civil war of the 1990s. Now, I hope that doesn't happen, and I think there's less of a chance happening than in the 90s, but it is still a reality. So it's something that we should pay close attention to. Also, the Pashtun dynamic within these ethnic tensions is something we can't lose sight of. We have to understand all of the ethnic dynamics that are at play, but the Pashtun perspective is really important because not only is this a rural insurgency, but it mostly takes place in Pashtun areas. In fact, if you looked at the bulk of the significant events in this insurgency over the last couple of years, it would almost look like a stencil going over the eastern and southern portion of the country. Now, granted, the insurgency has manifested itself in some of the urban areas in the west and the north, but by and large, this insurgency is taking place in the Pashtun-dominated areas. Now, why does that matter? Because the Pashtun informal society that normally has governed the outlying areas where the central government could not, it really matters a lot. The Pashtun informal civil society systems of security, economic development, agriculture, conflict resolution, and governance, these were all critical components of rural civil society within Pashtun communities that handled the day-to-day aspects of stability when there was a gap between top-down and bottom-up. Well, now, those informal systems have been severely damaged over the last 30 years of Soviet warfare, of ethnic civil war, of Taliban oppression, of our presence there and our operations there. It has cumulatively damaged Pashtun civil society as well as many rural areas of civil society. But in the Pashtun areas where the insurgency is most contentious, the informal society mechanisms are really messed up. And in many cases, they've been co-opted by Islamists, by nefarious actors. And so the goods and services that were normally provided by many of the pragmatic rural Pashtun elders have now been supplanted in many cases by Islamists. And so this was the reason in 2009 that the Special Operations community really started the Village Stability Program. We recognized internally, as we looked introspectively over the last decade of our performance in this war, that rolling out from built-up forward operating bases and combat outposts and driving to work to chase down targets was simply not getting the job done. We needed to stop driving to work. We needed to move into many of these strategic communities and help local Afghans stand up for their own communities, and then, and only then, connect to the government in a way that was locally appropriate. That was the whole essence of Village Stability Operations. And today, the last point I want to make, the last reality I want to make to you, is that as we go into Overwatch, as we go into transition, the ability to assist the rural component of informal society, especially in the Pashtun areas, is going to be very challenged. Now remember, this is the area where most of the population live. It's the area where most social uprisings have occurred from. And it's going to be the toughest area for us to influence as we go into Overwatch. So what's the big so what on that one? Well, I'll tell you. My takeaway from teaching with Howard is I would strongly recommend that you develop a mechanism or a methodology for learning what the sources of instability are in these rural areas. We cannot ignore those. Those sources of instability are what allow the insurgents and other nefarious actors to co-opt these civil society mechanisms. So we've got to learn what these sources of instability are. And Howard Clark's paper on consonance and stability operations, or the district stability framework, these are great places to start. But incorporate that into your pre-mission training. The second piece is really paying attention to local resiliencies. These are the actors and organizations that are already postured in informal society to stand up and help stabilize many of these rural areas that are beyond the reach of the government. It's these local actors, these local resiliencies that we've got to continue to learn to identify and empower if we're serious about long-term stability in Afghanistan. So thanks for watching today. I hope you found this helpful in some way, and I look forward to seeing you at our next video broadcast. Until then, Scott Mann, Director and Founder of the Stability Institute, and thanks for watching.